All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining me in the Global Power Platform Bootcamp, the Milano edition. In different times, would have loved to be there in Milano with each and every one of you, but we'll have to wait a bit to see. In that case, let's get on, because I do have a lot of things to show to you as well. So who am I? My name is Benny de Jager. I'm from Belgium as well. I'm an enterprise data architect at a company called Inetum Reeldolmen. Pretty much means it's a consultancy business, and on my day-to-day basis, I sit in Teams meetings, I write documents in Words, and I put way too much stuff in my OneNote notebooks. That's pretty much what I do these days. If I have any free time, I'm engaged in this user group in Belgium called datedminds.be. We do all sorts of things related to the Microsoft Data and AI platform. And if you want to reach out to me, if you want to find me on the social channels as well, my social handles are listed on the slide, and you can reach out to me. But let's get cracking. I do want you to give some form of expectations before I dive into all of this as well. Well, first off, I want to start a bit with telling you what you shouldn't be doing and some things you want to keep in mind for yourselves. But it boils down to an introduction, because we cannot cover everything in 45 minutes, to some of the underlying psychology when thinking about visualizations, and to help you being able to make the decision to pick the right visual and the right colors for the job at hand. And as well, very importantly, to make sure that you keep in mind that you are aware of what inclusive design can entail, because that is something very important to keep in mind as well. But the use case, some context. I come from a little town called Hsl, which is about 15 kilometers north of Antwerp in Belgium. And I went to college there as well. And I always saw these little bikes called these little vélos drive around town. And they're pretty much public sharing bikes you can pick up from a station, drive around, and then put them back. I asked for their data to say that I want to do some experiments on this, and they would only hand out the aggregated data up until the day level for public use, which wasn't good enough for me because I wanted something more than that. So I went to my trusty friend called Bing, and I started looking for things. And I found out that the city of New York has the exact same thing, only a lot bigger than what the city of Antwerp has to offer. They have a lot more bikes, they have a lot more traffic, and thus a lot more data as well. That data is publicly available. You can get a CSV file per month starting at June 2013, and they put up a new CSV file each and every single month. Right now, the transaction levels are at 96, 97 million, which makes it a very interesting data set if you want to start testing out some things for performance issues or something. They also give some things for master data about stations, about bikes, about regions, those kinds of things. So it is interesting to build out a simple star schema model as well for Power BI purposes. If you'll see any demos in Power BI, this is what the data will be related to. So trips, durations, and counts, etc. The first time I did this session was at a local community college in Mechelen in Belgium, where I presented the session for students in the marketing department, the accounting department, the information technology department, so non-technical students. And I asked them, well, if I say to you data visualization, what do you think of? What are your most random thoughts that pop up? So I got some input like graphs and charts, and that it's intended to tell stories. Most people also correlate this with pie charts. And then the one that triggered me the most was that they said was it looks easy, but it is hard. And there is a core of truth in there, because it is easy to slap some things on there, but to actually do it right, it does require some thinking, which is with most of things in life. But the core of the message that I've tried to tell them is what you put inside of your message, what you put as your core visualization, will influence the message as well. So, for instance, we've all seen some variant of this pop around somewhere, where they're saying you have soda, and these are the amount of sugar cubes that are in said container of soda. So us as humans, we're pretty much trained to know that a sugar cube is okay, but if you go ahead and start stacking 20 sugar cubes into one container of drinks, that is something that you need to consume in moderation. So logically, this is, if we see this, we have to think, okay, well, maybe I shouldn't drink an entire bottle of Coca-Cola in an hour or something. Let's change around this message a bit and say, how many donuts are inside of one drink? And we have the topmost container, which is about the same volume as well as the one that we saw in the message before, and that equals to 6 donuts. So I, for one, don't know the exact amount of sugar that is inside of one single donut, but people are actually drawing through conclusions from this one that donuts are probably healthier than they thought. And my conclusion was that, well, I actually want a donut right now. But by changing out the measure of sugar cubes to donuts, the complete message of the complete intention of the message is changed, and it might not be perceived as well as you thought it would be perceived. So that is something that is a very important thing to keep in mind. But there are some more things to keep in mind as well. For instance, just to set the scene a bit, is that Salvador Dali started with the fact in saying that we shouldn't fear perfection because we'll never reach it. And this, for me, is a very important one for data visualization purposes, because there is no such thing as a perfect dashboard. There is no such thing as a perfect data visualization, which means that we should strive for it, but there is no way we'll please every single user that is out there, but give it best effort. But also, data visualization is intelligence made visible. The more thought we put into our visualizations, hopefully, the better our message is perceived by the users on the other side. And how we're getting that message across is that data visualization is the intermediary between information and understanding. But as I said, what not to do, let's dive into an example that I found on the wondrous world of the internet. So for instance, this visualization I found on Reddit, and my Danish is a bit rusty, but it actually says what are the amount of traffic accidents that have occurred in the years. So they use the gauge, which is an interesting choice, but they decided to misuse the gauge and saying that the years are on the scale and that the amount of accidents that have occurred in that year, in that time span, were actually put on the gauge itself. So it completely misconstrues the message, as actually, if we look at the numbers for 2020, the numbers went down, but it looks way more dramatic as it is. So there are, out on the wondrous worlds of the internet, there are many different options out there, and many different examples of bad pie charts and bad data visualizations out there that can completely create completely different messages that we want to get across. And for time's sakes, I'm not going to bombard into the 20,000 pie chart jokes that I usually do, but I'll just crack on as well. Because the thing is as well is that when I spoke to those students, they actually thought that data visualization is something that we didn't start doing until we were given these fancy BI tools, or the lesser fancy BI tools like reporting services or Crystal reports, if you're a bit older than 20 years old. It actually means, that's what I tried to tell them as well, is that data visualization has been around for centuries. And an example, there are more examples out there. This is something that is right now with the kids these days is extremely popular, because it is tied to the fact that this is actually a candlestick chart, and it is most commonly used for stock prices for cryptocurrencies, for GameStop shares, whatever. And I've seen a lot of young people take interest into how to interpret this specific type of visualization. The cool thing for me is that it's actually been around since the early 1700s in Japan, where it was used for Japanese rice trade stock center, which means that when the farmers arrived at the stock to sell their rice, they could actually see and interpret how well the price of rice was faring, or if they should be coming back the next day, or if they should sell immediately because the price is at an all-time high, which means that for them, it is a really interesting tool to see. And to quickly dive into how this works is it means that green means the price has gone up in a specific period, because a candlestick refers to a specific period, 5 minutes a day, a week, whatever. Red means it's gone down. And then the rectangles is where it started and ended, the ends of the rectangle. And then the lines that stick out of it is the highest and the lowest point it reached in said period. So in short, we can see that this stock has done pretty okay over these past few periods, which means that with not a lot of words, the message can actually come across. But why does this thing called data visualization matter? Well, it allows us to research data and to investigate some curious effects that we otherwise would miss. It helps us identify insights, because if we were to have to dig through 17 pages of Excel tables, we wouldn't find out about these things. So it helps us with a single glimpse to understand what is happening, what we need to understand about this, but also look for relationships and patterns and spot trends or positive trends or negative trends that might be influencing our decisions. But most importantly, whenever we have a finished product of data visualization, it helps us communicate what we found to other people. Rather than splashing those 17 Excel tables to someone, we can give them a few well-put data visualizations, a few well thought of graphs to help them understand better what is trying to come across. So why does this data visualization actually work better than having these large graphs? Well, it means, for instance, simply put, that about 90% of the information that gets sent to our brain on a daily basis is visual. It's the visual stimuli that occur the most often for most people out there. Because there is a lot of visual stimuli, people will roughly put remember about 80% of what we see and about 20% of what we read from the first time, which means that it takes a lot more effort into reading and understanding than it is to just glimpsing at something and looking at it for a few seconds. Which explains why studying for college was hard in the past as well, because that was a lot of text to consume. And it boils down to the fact that when we look at these visual stimuli, it tailors to the way our brain functions, because our brain, bluntly put, as I said, this is introduction, works in two types of systems. It's a fast system and a slow system. And the fast system on the left-hand side is actually, it does the unconscious. It has these small reflexes to be able to respond quickly to something that requires zero to no effort to interpret. Meaning we're doing these types of decisions all day long. Should I open that door? Yes, no. How do I open that door? And move your hand towards the door handle. Do I want a coffee? All these impulses, all these stimuli are handled by our fast system. Quickly, at reflex, without any effort, and that's the way it does this. And on the other hand, we have our slower system, which is intended to do the more big, heavy lifting, to think about more complex things. The thing is, it requires us to focus, to concentrate, because it takes more effort. For instance, when you're in deep thought and someone interrupts you, there is a high chance of you losing that train of thought. And it's a system that we use for analytical purposes and to think about the more complex things. So the next slide, you're going to see two things on the slide. And you remember for yourself, because you cannot say it to me right now, is what you've seen first. Okay, go. So because of the fact that I'm cheating here and that I'm using moving images, I'm pretty sure that about 99% of you was looking at the pink fluffy unicorns dancing on rainbows first, and not at the mathematical equation on the right-hand side. So for your interest, the mathematical equation is 322, and it is indeed a pink fluffy unicorn dancing on rainbows on the left-hand side. Well, why is this? Because inherently, we all have the attention spans of squirrels. We all respond to shiny, moving things, which is why using data visualization, a visual interpretation, is actually a very good thing to help us get the message across. But how do we actually go about to do this? That is where we start digging into some of the things that we need to keep in mind. that we need to make sure that we can use to actually help us get along. Just taking the Q&A window as well. Okay, so there is this thing called pre-attentive attributes. And in a nutshell, this means that pre-attentive attributes help us, well, help the designer influence the way that a report consumer, a viewer, look at the visualizations we designed. And we can look at them in 4 basic properties: color, form, movement, and spatial positioning. And by toying around with these, by influencing these, we can create a big difference in the way something is perceived. Why is this? Well, the human brain starts to process these things pretty much within 200 milliseconds of first exposure. So the second I turn to a new slide, your eyes are scanning the entire slide and they're looking at these things. And color and form pop out the most intensively as well. So color, form, spatial positioning, and movement. And form is actually the one that we can have the most wiggle room with, the most types of wiggle room, because we can start influencing this by using length and width, sizes and shapes, and actually start using these things to make sure that something needs to be highlighted the way that we want it to be highlighted, to pop out the way that we want it to have. Same thing with colors or with intensity. The thing is as well is that we need to keep we do need to keep in mind that not everything can be perceived ad infinitum. So some things do actually need to be used with moderation, because if we're making everything a flashy color, then we're just getting people a headache for free. And personally, within data visualization, within Power BI mostly, the movement aspect rarely pops up for me, because I don't typically use the bubble charts with a play axis or moving images inside of my Power BI reports. So they pop up less, but they are still important to keep in mind. But positioning also makes all the more of a difference. So keep in mind these pre-attentive attributes: form, color, spatial positioning, and movement, as they form the basis of what I'll dive into right now. Yep. There are these things of principles of visual perception that we need to keep in mind as well. Meaning, if I subject you to this image, and this is not a Rorschach test, by the way, if I subject you to this image, I can ask you, what are you seeing? But since I'm not going to wait on the delay for Teams Live, I can mention that most people will see the outlined black triangle, and it is, I don't know the exact specific psychological reaction for this, but it is the way that most people see it. While actually it's a white slide, a black square, and 3 white Pac-Mans laid on top of it. But our mind is going to interpret these a bit different, as saying that it is 3 white circles with a black triangle laid on top of it. So it is our mind playing tricks on us. And it is by playing around with these little properties that we can do some pretty cool stuff, or some very bad stuff, which we do not do. Same thing is if I go ahead and ask you what this is, and this is starting to look a bit more like a Rorschach test, but I've had varying responses to this. I've had people say that it's a Dalmatian. I've had people saying that it's a white spotted mare in a paddock kicking its hind leg. I've heard many different things, but it is a static image. If I turn this into a moving image, for most people, it should become a bit more clear that this is actually Dalmatian. And how is this possible? Well, it is the fact that the way that it's laid out, it's actually just a bunch of black spots laid on top of a white canvas, but it's our mind making sure that it's our mind suggesting that, hey, I know this pattern, it's this. It's our mind making a suggestion, and we pretty much follow along blindly in most of the cases. So this is called a principle of closure, for reference, but I'll get into that a bit as well further on, because the thing that I want to give to you as well is that these are called the Gestalt Principles, and the Gestalt Principles is not some Austrian or German scientist. out in the 1500s or something. No, it is actually a school of thought that emerged in the 20th century in Austria and Germany. And Gestalt, if your German is a bit proper as well, Gestalt is actually German for shadow and form. It means that it is actually the school of thought where they're playing around with forms of things. And the Gestalt principles, they're not tailored to data visualization specifically. They are actually commonly used inside of product design as well, or user interface design for web and applications, etc. But they do have a very big impact on the way that we design data visualizations as well, which is why these, for me personally, made the biggest difference when I was digging through a lot of the data visualization stuff. So something to keep in mind about these visual perception principles is that if we design a report, we need to understand and we need to perceive what role these psychologies play inside of visual perception. How are we influencing the report consumer in a good or in a bad way? And as I mentioned, ethically, we shouldn't lie to people, which means that we need to put them to good use. If you want to see some examples about how charts can bedazzle you and lie to you, blatantly lie to you, I suggest you get a chance to look at Alexander Arvidsson's session on how visuals lie, because that is some seriously eye-opening stuff. But also, what happens when someone sees our creations? How are they responding, and how are they understanding the message that we want to give to them? Are they actually understanding the message we intended? Those are things to keep in mind. But in short, these Gestalt principles help us determine which elements are most effective in a given situation. And they allow us to influence the visual perception and make sure that we direct attention to certain points of focus, and maybe even try to influence them to take some actions on this. But most importantly, it helps us design intuitive data visualizations to make sure that people can understand this without effort, because that's what it mostly is about. So Gestalt principles, they're usually displayed as a bunch of dots on a canvas, and then something is happening with them. This is exactly the same thing, meaning that I have a bunch of gray circles on the canvas right now, and this has popped up to the color changing as well, but it's now split up into black circles and black triangles, and our mind is going to perceive these as, hey, the form has changed of these things, of these circles. Maybe they don't belong to the same group as the black circles. So playing around with form allows the mind, usually tricks the mind into thinking that it is more than one group. And the same thing happens with color. So I've changed them right now to rectangles because I could. But we're seeing these gray rectangles as well, these gray squares, and then differently colored as well, which actually means that our mind is going to put less focus on the gray squares, and it is thinking that the gray squares are belonging to one single group, and that the other ones maybe aren't in a single group. And this is called a principle of similarity, where our mind is going to assume that things the same color and or form belong to a single group, which means that if we start using these principles, we can actually guide people into thinking, into understanding that they are similar. Roughly put, for Power BI, I'm not going to dive into every single one of the demos for time purposes. It means that we should stick to similar colors for things that are very similar. If we are looking at a unit, if you're looking at the amount of units that have been sold, we should go for a similar color for each one of those things that we want to display. And then for the sales price of those things, stick to a different color so that these can be understood with ease. Same thing happens if we look back at these little circles. They are all 4 by 4, and now they are 2 by 2. Well, they are 4 by 2, which actually means that our mind is going to perceive the left-hand side as one single group because they are the same shape, same form, and the same color. And on the right-hand side, our mind is going to perceive 2 different groups because they are no longer in the same place, in the same position of these different things, which means that there is a bit of spacing in between them. This relates to the principle we call proximity, meaning if something is in the proximity, based on the proximity of one element towards the other, our mind can perceive it as the same thing. What does this mean in Power BI specifically? Well, how are we positioning our labels? How are we positioning our titles? How are we positioning slicers as opposed to our actual visualizations, or opposed to our actual graphs? Are you putting them a long way around, or can people actually visually see it in the same glance where they are at? Proximity, for me, is a very important one, especially with the positioning of text to support the visualizations. And it is often overlooked, I have to admit. But a few more. We have same circles again, this time a row of gray circles and a row of red circles. So our mind is probably going to think that it is two different types. The red ones are grouped together and the gray ones are grouped together. So the second I change this, it's a bit, I drew a rectangle over the most left two, and then draw another rectangle and another rectangle. It actually means that right now, because of the fact that they are no longer visually in the same container, but that they are in some sort of other region, our mind is going to be influenced to think that it's actually converted, that it's actually divided into three different groups, and that we can also interpret them the same way. And it's called the principle of common region. If they are related to each other in the same region, the same thing happens with the principle. It's also called the principle of enclosure, etc. Because when they are tied into the same container, our mind is going to perceive them as, hey, they're grouped together, so they're probably have some meaning as well. Moving on, we have the principle of continuity, meaning that how are you looking at the left one, for instance, the top left, the left visualization? Are you looking at this as this is a line moving upwards straight and we have this little jiggly line coming across of it? Or are you actually looking at this is the black line and this is the red line? How are you looking at the way that this is moving forward? And it is a combination of shape and form that every single mind actually interprets a little bit differently. Most people, they follow the way of the colors going towards the other direction, which means that for a continual movement by shape, form, or color, the mind is starting to perceive these differently as well. So I am going to briefly go into the demos as well, a bit shortly after, but these are some key things to keep in mind. And as I mentioned, we also have movements inside of Power BI, but I barely use them in reports that I actually present, because some of them actually have to be printed and they are, well, it's not that interesting. But consider the bottom visualization, because that is moving and a bit more easy to explain to you, is that we actually have 6 blue dots. And because of the fact that 3 of those dots are moving upward and 3 of those dots are moving downward, this is our mind thinking, hey, they're actually going the same direction, or they share a common fate, so they have to be related somehow. Which means that by moving them around or having the common fate, we can actually use them in the same way to influence the direction. Or these are some of the graphs that we've all seen before, and I've had endless discussions on whether this is a black chalice on a white canvas, or if these are actually two white heads or if these are two white heads overlaid on a black rectangle. The same thing with this one. Is it actually Steve Jobs' face that is overlaid into a white canvas, or is this a white apple laid on top of a black image? And it is called the principle of figure and ground, which means that the way our background is related and the way that the figure is related that we are laying on top of this, the way these two relate to each other will drastically influence the message we're trying to send across. For instance, this looks like a map that has some dynamic bullets on top of it. But in reality, this is actually someone that manually placed a bunch of dots onto a white canvas and then pasted a world map on the back end of as a background figure. Why is this? Well, for most people, geography is not their strong suit, and they have a very they understand better if they actually see this little dot called Horn of Africa laid out on top of a map with a bullet attached to it, than saying, well, I have Horn of Africa 195. And it is this principle called figuring ground, where we're placing a background to amplify the message. We can actually do the completely same thing with Power BI by using backgrounds and screens to amplify where we're placing measures and slicers, or placing slicers or certain graphs. And it is simply to help guide where people need to be for this. So a very simple principle, but it can lead to some really great things. And last one. This is actually the one that I tend to favor the most. It's called the focal point, meaning, do you have an element that needs to pop out, that needs to be very visible, that needs to spring to attention, the first one? This is actually an element that you can give a more vibrant color to actually spring out and give that message a little bit better. Focal point. As I mentioned, this should be used with moderation as well, because if everything is a focal point, then nothing is a focal point. And I'm going to skip the closure one to be able to have enough time for the different things as well. So in a nutshell, because I have to be really quickly at this, these are called the Gestalt Principles. And I do encourage you to go reading a bit on these, because they can play a very big role in the way that we're designing our Power BI reports. But how do we actually pick the right visual? This in itself is a topic to fill an entire day on, but to put it into a small synopsis, a small summary, it boils down to explore the data, know what you're dealing with of the data. What is the data? What does it mean? Speak, when possible, with business people. Have some short chats with them, and make sure that you are familiar with the business context and what does it mean when the amount X is related to XYZ. So what I've typically done in the past as well is actually, I call this the coffee method. Is actually I try to go with them. Right now it's a bit more difficult, I know. I try to go with them to the coffee machine, grab a coffee, and then just have some informal chats and have them explain something. Because I found as well is that when they're put a bit at ease, they're more open to sharing things with you when they're not inside of this confined environment where they have to look at things. All right, but it also means that we should pay extra attention to what we have in our data. So we should be aware of what are the amounts of the data that we have? What are the distributions? How is it proportionized? Are we having data that is sequentially going upwards, or are we having data that has a very strong emphasis on the minimum side and on the maximum side and nothing in between? It is about knowing that data and knowing what it actually means that will help us to make these decisions. But most importantly, it's also about the uncertainty. How predictive is the data that we're going to be using? Or is it well possible that we're now speaking about data that's going from 1 to 1,000, and then the day after tomorrow, we actually see some records popping in there for 1 million, making the lower regions completely unreadable. It is about knowing the data, and that is crucial to everything we do with this. So when we know the data, we can actually help and go ahead and start picking the right visualization. And I have some tools that actually help me do this. The links are included in the slide deck. And it actually means that I can go ahead and say, well, I want to plot a change over time. And then I can go ahead and start going a bit through like this as a decision tree to help me pick what I need to be using. So the one that I use mostly is the Financial Times visual vocabulary. But there is also the possibility of going to the other one called data to vis, which is a bit more effectively in that design, in that this decision tree modus. But it also gives you a bit more interactive results, a bit more interactive examples, etc. And most importantly, the one that I like most as well is that they have this caveats part as well, where they say, when you're doing this, make sure that you keep this in mind as well. Because I am seeing a comment as well from Nicola, where he's saying that when a line chart has about 10 elements or more, it actually becomes unusable. So it is the fact that there are a lot of things that come into play when we're designing these data visualizations. For instance, the pie charts as well, where they're going into why pie charts should be used with caution as well. So as I mentioned, we can go into this for about 3 hours, but I actually only have 45 minutes, and a lot of the time is actually already gone. Links are in the slide deck, and I'll make sure that this is shared with you as well. So when we're picking colors, we have to realize that colors are subjective, and not every person responds in exactly the same way. They have a very different cultural meaning, and there has been a lot of effort and research going into these colors and how we can pick them more properly as well. So right now, should have changed the slide. Now we're going to focus on the Hsl model, where the hue, saturation, and luminance means that a hue is actually something that people describe as a color: blue, red, green, yellow. And the saturation means how hard this color differs from neutral gray. How much intensity has been put onto this. And then the luminous means that when we take the combination of the hue and the saturation, how much black, how much dark color is added to add a bit more warmth or coolness to this specific color. But for me, picking colors and palettes boils down to about 9 steps. And as I mentioned, step 1 is knowing what the data is. Know what the data means, speak to those business peoples, and have a clue about what is happening. And then pick your aspects or measures that you want to be using, and do stick to one single aspect per color. If needed, we can go ahead and start picking scales as well, but we should be very, very careful with that as well, because I will dig into that a bit further. But the scales of our data usually boil down to one of these 3 options, where we have sequential, when our data goes naturally from a low to a high, or possibly when we have divergent data, when we have data on both ends of the scale, minimums and maximums, and there is a very important pivot point in the middle. Or when the data does not actually have an order of magnitude, but it's actually just things like names or categories that we're trying to plot onto a graph that we're using to filter or to slice, etc. But I also encourage you to look at obvious options. If you know your data, you know that there's potentially already an application out there. Is it something that naturally occurs, or is it something that is actually a known object? And then what I mean with this is, if, for instance, I want to visualize the spread of M&Ms inside of a bag, I'm not going to pick brown for green M&Ms, and I'm not going to pick pink for red M&Ms, etc. I'm going to use the colors that are inside of that little bag of M&Ms, because that is something that people will naturally relate to. Corporate style guides are very interesting as well, because they actually can help us. The thing is, corporate style guides are not always designed for data visualization. So do keep in mind that you need to test it a bit and see if it's actually usable. But it boils down to picking colors that users will easily understand. That's something that we need to strive for as well. But how do we go ahead and decide on the number of the base colors, the number of the hues that we have? Well, when I spoke about sequential, divergent, and qualitative data, it means that usually for sequential data, we can use one hue for a aspect that we're trying to visualize. So one base color, and then playing around with a bit of the luminance and saturation to create a scale. The thing is, when we're creating these things and we're creating a scale, when we're creating these scales, it can become very hard to perceive. So If we're having a lot of similar data points in there, we might consider using more hues, but we do need to keep in mind that we're not turning it into a single color book, because that can actually happen as well. If we're looking at the divergent data, we typically want to be looking at 2 different base colors and then making sure that we can use saturation or luminance towards the neutral gray. So actually playing around with these scales of data. And then qualitative data usually requires as many hues as we have values, but we do have to keep the limitations of the human brain into thought as well, because our brain actually struggles to perceive and remember more than 7 colors. Then it's starting to struggle a bit, and 7 is pushing it. If we go above 12, then actually it starts to become a blob, and not everyone is perceiving it the same way. Most importantly, I want you to be consistent. When you pick a color, be consistent with this, especially in the same report, but ideally across reports you're designing, across reports within your department or organization. Why is this? Well, your end users, they will start to develop a mental map and start to associate things with these different colors, with these measures that you're using. And if it becomes more familiar, it helps with those pre-attentive attributes, and is the first exposure that we have on a single visual. And for me personally, I like this a lot, is that gray can actually be used inside of a report. Not everything has to be bright flashing pink or whatever. We can actually design an entire report using gray, and then starting to add little bits of splashes of color to try to add this contrast, to try to add this focal point when we're looking at these types of data. It doesn't have to be vibrant colors, please, because I've gotten some serious headaches from reports I've seen in the wild. And then if we're going to want to create our actual palette, there are some tools that I've included in here. We can actually go ahead and start picking the colors we want. And then you need to decide if you want a warm, so the more vibrant colors, or a cool scale for your base color. Looking at the ways that we can go ahead and start picking colors, well, we can actually look at monochromatic data, monochromatic scale, which means that it's just a single color, and then we're using different saturations and luminance of this base color, making it ideal and preferred for sequential data. Analog color means that we have a base color, and it is on the left and the right side of the color on the color wheel, and we can actually go ahead and use these for sequential data as well to add a bit more variation, but do not go overboard with this. And then if we're looking at the diverging data, where data has the minimum and the maximum values with a pivot point in the middle, this is where we can use the opposite colors or the complementary colors as well. So colors that sit on the opposite ends of the color wheel. Okay, yeah. Triadic colors as well, which means that they are pretty commonly used for qualitative palettes, meaning when we're using categories in the side of the same visualization, and they need to be distinguishable by color, but we can also do more than 3, we can do 4, we can do 5, whatever. When you've picked your colors, please do keep in mind that we are checking for accessibility. Color blindness is one thing, but also how large are your fonts, those kinds of things. So I do highly encourage you to go look at the accessibility checklist by Megan Longoria, because she has a very, very good list to start checking what you're actually doing. And I do encourage you to do this. And real quickly, I'm going to show you the tool that I usually use for picking out my colors, and it's called Adobe Color. It is completely free, and you can enter a base value where you can say, I want to have this color. It's going to change this for me, and then say, I want a complementary, I want a monochromatic color, and it's going to do every single thing for me. But most importantly, I can actually go ahead to these accessibility tools, and it's going to hint me to whether the fact that my color choices are okay or not okay, which is an important thing to keep in mind. Then, if you've got those colors, create a theme file. Make sure that you can reuse these with ease. But I do have to blast through a bit to wrap up. Some things I want you to keep in mind is that these Gestalt principles and pre-attentive attributes can have some serious influence on what you're doing. Colors are key, but don't overdo it on these things. And when you've picked your colors, make sure that they are accessible, that we keep these things in mind so we can actually use these things properly. And tell your stories and make sure that it is an intuitive one and that people enjoy your story. So if you want to go do it yourself, there is this thing called Workout Wednesday. You can follow the hashtag WOW2021 on Twitter, and they post a weekly challenge for you to actually start doing things yourself. In the slide deck, I'll share the link as well. There's a bunch of reading material you can go through, a bunch of resources, etc. And you can reach out to me on the social channels if you have any questions. I will answer the ones that are inside of the chat window here as well. But if there's no questions, I would like you to fill in the survey, both for the event and both for my session. I had to blast through pretty quickly, but I am very interested in what you have to say about my session and whether you found it interesting or not. That said, thank you for your attention. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I hope to meet you in person somewhere soon. Thank you.
Benny.
Yep.
If you want, there's a question.
Yeah.
From Nicola.
Yeah. So Nicola asked, what do I think of is the best visual way to show a lot of trends, like time on the x-axis, data on the y-axis, let's say 50 or 60 elements? Ooh. That is a tricky question. Especially how are they related? Is it one single aspect, or are they two different aspects? Are they two different aspects or not? Because how I would tackle this is, if it is possible, to not go on the most granular level from the very start, but actually invite them to go into drilling through a bit to make sure that they can look at the more general approach and then go further into the details if they actually need to do it. Because I found that if we give them too many details to start off with, people can get a bit overwhelmed and they may not necessarily get the right context. If it's all the same aspect and they need those details, I suggest looking at playing around a bit with the saturation and the scales for your color that you're using, to make sure that you can have a bit of an influence in the way that this is perceived as well. But yeah, 50 to 60 elements on a single line graph, that's a tricky one, I have to admit. Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, well, thank you. Lorenzo, thank you for having me. It's been fun. If there's any more questions, let me put it on there one last time. People can reach out to me and I'll do my very best to help them. One more question, how do I make sure that the slides reach the people? Oh, yeah. So I'll share a link to my GitHub page. There we go. So the link I've put inside of the chat window is where the slides will arrive as soon as I do a git push on my desktop, and then people can find the slides there, and I'll make sure I'll send them over to Fabio as well. Thank you for having me, and enjoy the rest of your day.